Well, thank you, Ian, and thank you, everyone, wherever you're tuning in from this evening for this talk. The I'm dialing in from Berlin, where I am at the moment with the US Air Force, looking at the Berlin airlift. So I'm going to empty my head of stuff to do with 1948, 49, and
Mm.
start to fill it again with some the subject which I'm very passionate about, close to my heart. Two subjects actually, not only football, but also the Dardanelles campaign. And this talk came about really as a result to some background work I'm doing into a PhD currently that I'm researching. And again, this came about in turn because the Army Football Association moved their offices about a year ago. And as they were sort of closing things down, they opened a cupboard, and in there was a big stack of paperwork, right from the very first post-it note from a guards officer in the 1860s saying, "What about this soccer malarkey? Do you think we should have a look at it?" And so, really, the history of Army football has remained in this sort of wardrobe that no one knew existed, not been in the public domain. And it's thrown up a number of research questions, including the one that I'm going to look at is what exactly is the impact of football on the British Army in the Great War? So whilst that's currently being catalogued at the National Army Museum, I've focused my studies particularly in the area of the Dardanelles because it's somewhere I'm comfortable with. And as a result, that's the talk that we're going to look at this evening. Now, I'm very aware that some of you will not be football fans, and you'll probably think this is 11 grown men running around kissing each other, and it's not the same as rugby and all that. And what I should say straight away is it's okay to like both. All right, you don't need to take sides. I've been passionate about football since I was a young child, first taken by my grandfather, and still have the pleasure of now going with my son every week. But why should we talk about football with regards to the subject that really we're here for, which is military history and in particular the Dardanelles campaign? Well, let's leave it to a few quotes from others. And we start with George Orwell in 1984, who says that films, football, beer, and gambling filled up the horizons of their minds. Well, that's a very interesting little thing to just reflect on a while, isn't it? Um, Robert Coles, who's a professor of international sports history, takes that one further. He says, I think it is a major subject, not in itself perhaps, but the way that football is woven into almost everything else we do. It is one of England's great civil cultures. Now, at this point, I must add, because I recently gave a talk at the National Army Museum about football in general, I was on part of a panel looking at football and war, and that was tweeted by the National Army Museum. And the very first comment was from a lovely chap in Scotland who said, "Oh, I see, only England again." As you'll find out, we are going to talk about England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, Germany, and Turkey in this talk. So this is not purely about England. All right. So don't switch off if you are from north of the border. Um, Dominic Sandbrook, who I'm a bit of a fan of as cultural historian, he made a brilliant point, which is why the photograph's there at the bottom of the screen, which is if you were to write about the Romans, it would be weird not to write about gladiatorial games or chariot racing. So why should we not write about Britain's obsession with football? And that makes a very valid point. Pretty much everything in the 20th century to do with British history is impacted in some way by our football. Tom Holland, the Roman historian, goes further and says, we've replaced nearly all of those forms of combat that the Romans brought to us with a spectacle of 22 men kicking a football around. This is our modern day version of gladiatorial games on a domestic footing. So let's look at the origins of football and army football because the two are absolutely interlinked. It's 1863 when a number of public schools and organized clubs and social clubs looked at the various rules around football, whether that be rugby union, rugby league, whatever, and broke away to really form what we know as the Football Association. And some of the early competitive teams that we see in the game at that time included a number of army units that were playing from around about the time, the mid 1860s, is when we first see football teams emerging in the army. Best example of that, perhaps, is the Royal Engineers. Their Army Football, the Royal Engineers Football Association or Football Club, still exists today. And they proudly wear, as you can see there, the FA Cup on their badge because they appeared in it twice, 1872, and then won the FA Cup in 1875. So in those early informative years, as football started to develop, the Army played a key role in that. Now, by the time we get to the 1880s, it's now a mass spectator sport, certainly across all of the cities, whether that's in the south of England, certainly the industrial North Midlands, and very much in the northwest and northeastern country, partly because, we now started to introduce this idea of having a Saturday afternoon off work. So you would flock down to the local football field and support the local team. So in 1888, the Football League comes into existence, which is going to organise a league tournament every season amongst these early clubs. And in exactly the same year, the Army Football Association is also formed. That's still going to this day. So the reason I mention that is because we look at the parallels and we can see that often, if you look at Army surfboarding, you'll find that it probably started 10 years ago when some officer went to Hawaii, says, I quite like this, let's take up surfing. But with regards to football, it starts in the Army exactly the same time as it starts in the English psychology. So therefore, it's been part of the same journey from the very beginning. And I think that's quite important to think of. Now, let's look at some of those early sides. And here we see the Royal Engineers team that made the final in 1872. That was their first FA Cup final. And that was played at the Oval. The cricket ground is where it was played. And firstly, look at those kits. They're quite incredible, aren't they, really? They're wearing sort of stockings on their heads. Why did they do so well? Well, we know Paul Brown, who does a bit of a match report on those early games, said that the Royal Engineers were playing a new style of football for the time. Until then, football was a fairly basic game involving a kick and rush style of football. Several players would charge after the ball, but the Royal Engineers changed all that. They started to pass the ball, relying more on teamwork. That's a really fascinating last line, because what that links us to is the importance of teamwork within the Army to get the job done, and the opportunities that playing football offers to soldiers to improve that teamwork. And that's something that we see in 1918 that comes into doctrine. If you look at pamphlet SS 143, it tells you there as a young officer that if you've got a decent football team in your battalion, they're likely to be a good battalion, because all of those skills and attributes are passed across from soccer to soldiering. So, it actually changes doctrine by 1918. Here's the first sort of myth-busting thing, which we often hear, which is that football is played largely by the working class and no one else. If we look at that Royal Engineers starting 11 of 1875, that wins the FA Cup, you will see that one thing links them all the way down. They're all commissioned men. There is a period where football is played by public schools and then starts to turn over to working class, more kind of factory-based, social club-based teams by the time we get to the start of the 20th century. But back when the Royal Engineers won the FA Cup, every last one of them was an officer. By 1914, it's changed again. What we can see is Captain Curtis comments in 1914 that what a change in a few years. Football has completely emptied the barrack rooms. Shall it also be said of the canteens? Now, what he's getting at there is football is a really good way of keeping men occupied. Think about the 11th of November 1918, those who have studied Douglas Haig and some of his war diary entries. On the 11th of November 1918, he's not saying, can I have moe delivered, please, to my chateau, partly because he's in a rather small house and actually occupying a railway carriage in Uwe railway station, a little siding not far from Combray, when the armistice is signed. But what he actually says is, right, we need to keep the lads busy. Let me know, what do you need? Cricket bat, footballs, and I think he mentions hockey sticks or something. So even Haig himself realizes the importance of sport for keeping people active. And if we look at some of the things that football gives the Army and why it's relevant, first one is morale. And we're going to look at that in detail shortly when we look at the Dardanelles Cup. discipline. Now, I know when we see the modern Premier League players rolling around on the floor, whatever, we might say, what is this about discipline? But actually, a team sport encourages a very different type of discipline than basic training in the army does, which is personal discipline. So that team thing is very important. Fitness has got to be important as well. What more fun way to keep fit than chasing a ball around? I'm 56. I still play football twice a week. And I turn into a 3-year-old border terrier when someone kicks a ball. My tongue comes out, and I go running after it like it's the most important thing in my life for an hour. Esprit de corps. If your football team is doing well, you're doing well. It gives you bragging rights quite often as well. It's motivation. At times when campaigns are stagnating and standing still, maybe your sport that you're playing away from the front line is your motivation to get up, to give you something to think about. And as mentioned before, teamwork is very important. And also, it also fosters leadership skills, the sort of stuff that you need to be as a commander, whether that's a young officer or whether an NCO. That leadership quality is something that you can gain on a football field. Why is that relevant to the First World War, the Great War in particular, and also in the Gallipoli Campaign that obviously takes up the large parts of 1915? Well, let's look at this. 3 things, really. Escapism. After the August offensive on the 21st of August 1915, Gallipoli really loses its kind of offensive edge. People, if you served there, you'd have been aware that we're not really going forward anymore. We're kind of holding our line. It becomes a kind of a mundane existence where you're still being killed on a regular basis. Football would offer you escapism away from that without having to get on a boat and leave the peninsula to go to an island. So we can see that in the way it's written about and the comments from the soldiers there at the time. Football is a real escapism. Second one, army expansion. For the first time in history, you no longer need to be a 6'2" guardsman with great fitness to enlist in the army. We need to get the ranks of civilian street into khaki so that we have an army sizable to eventually deliver us victory in 1918. So as a result, that army expansion, we are perhaps taking in people who don't have the same levels of fitness as the pre-war army. Football can offer that. And that is compounded by the fact that we have the static nature that comes in from total war, because static warfare means you're not on the move, you're not lumping kit around, you're not continually moving forward as a line moves. You can stagnate in a foxhole or a trench. So again, we've got to keep you fit. So the time you're out of the line, what better way than football? So that's why a lot of the things that I mentioned are almost concentrated because of the particular circumstances of not only the First World War, but the Gallipoli Campaign. Now, as you can see from that there, this is a postcard actually from the 1907 Army Cup final played out between the Depot Battalion of the Royal Engineers at Chatham and the 2nd Battalion of the Bedfords, who at that time are based at Tidworth. Not sure the exact score. It wouldn't take a lot to work it out, I'm certain. But that Army Cup final is still played for today. So it's a competition that has sort of survived the test of time. And in this year's Army Football Association manual, which they kindly sent me, it lists the qualities of football, and they are identical to the ones that I mentioned there on the left. So even today, we're looking at the same reasons why football is relevant as we did 100 years ago. So lots of regiments took it on board. This magnificent photograph is of the 1st Battalion of the Royal Munster Fusiliers and their football team, who clearly was fairly successful. If you look at some of the footballing medals pinned on the chest of the men, and you also see the trophy they won down the front there, which is something that was going on in India at the time. The poster on the left is a post-First World War recruiting sort of poster. But you can see it highlights the reason why you should join the Royal Munster Fusiliers, and it invites particularly people, sportsmen and smart men. A good, clean sporting life is offered with a assured future. And you can see all around there the types of sports that were being played, including football, up there in the top left corner. Now, these are particularly interesting to me. This photograph was sent to me by someone whose father is in the actual photograph in the Gallipoli Association. Maybe they're on line tonight. It'd be lovely to hear from if you are. And the reason this is interesting is because what happens to the Royal Munster Fusiliers, 1st Battalion? Well, initially, quite an excellent little book there by Chris Holland about what happened before Gallipoli to the 29th Division. They're based in Warwickshire. And here you can see the band of the 1st Battalion Royal Munster Fusiliers in Warwickshire. And as part of the preparation for going overseas, a charity game is arranged on the 23rd of January between Coventry City and the Royal Munster Fusiliers. And incredibly, and I know it must be incredible for Ian to read this as a Coventry fan, City were to win, Sky Blues won this 8 goals to 3. Rather disappointingly, the crowd for this, a charity affair, was 700 spectators. The reason? Well, firstly, was it really a competitive match? No, there was two 35-minute halves, which is quite bizarre, so a bit of an exhibition. But as the local press state, kicking off at 3 o'clock on a Monday, when everyone was at work, it's not surprising there was not a large attendance at Highfield Road. Of course, the score does not represent the play. One is very pleased to be able to pay tribute to the gentlemanliness and the splendid spirit of the soldier footballers. Several of the side gave clear indications of considerable ability, but lack of practice undoubtedly contributed to their failure. Now, that battalion, just a few months later, are going to disembark from here, the River Clyde. Not the most common used image of it, but still a lovely watercolour of the River Clyde landing at V Beach, and go straight into the maelstrom of the initial landings there at V Beach, as we know, very chaotic, with not only the Royal Munster Fusiliers, but the Dublin Fusiliers as well, men of the Hampshires and what have you. And of that starting 11 that played the friendly at Coventry City just a few months earlier, 6 of those men are going to be killed in the Dardanelles campaign, Gallipoli campaign, including Sergeant O'Hanlon, who is buried at V Beach Cemetery. And you can see his grave there on the left. So, that's over half the squad that turned out at Coventry are not going to survive the campaign. And this level of casualty is reflected in the footballing world as we continue. Fascinating character, this Bernard Doni of the 1st Royalists Inniskilling Fusiliers. Really interesting character. Born in the Bogside estate of Londonderry in 1882, and a very talented inside forward he was. In 1900 to 1904, 18 to when he was 22, he played for Derry Celtic, he played for Belfast Celtic, and also Glentoran. Actually got capped for Ireland, and this was in a sort of a friendly charity match against Scotland in 1902. And it was actually to raise funds for those lives that had been lost in the Ibrox Stadium disaster of the same year. But nevertheless, it is a cap for Ireland. Someone in Scotland must have been watching and picked up on him, because in 1904, he's actually signed by Hibs and scores 8 goals in 15 appearances for Hibernian, a result of which Manchester United get very interested in him, and he actually plays for 2 seasons for Manchester United. 1907 transfers to Burnley, and for whatever reason, maybe homesickness, we don't know, but in 1908 he returns back to Londonderry, and whilst there immediately enlists into the Army Reserves. He stays in the Army Reserves till 1915, where volunteering as a territorial force guy, he actually gets called up by the 1st Battalion of the Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers and sails for Gallipoli. And he's wounded at V Beach on the 25th of April, coming ashore there, shrapnel wound to the head. That pretty much is the end of his campaign in Gallipoli, certainly the end of his footballing career, but recovers enough from hospital in Egypt to rejoin the battalion on the Western Front, and very sadly is killed on the first day of the Battle of Somme, attacking Wye Ravine. He's one of 150 men from Londonderry who fell, and that day commemorated particularly on the Teat Vale Memorial. So next time you pass him, look him up. There's a guy here that played for Hibs, Manchester United and Burnley, and served at Gallipoli and killed on the 1st of July. I mean, quite incredible, really, the stuff that you would have seen and he went through.
Yeah.
Another chap here, Fred Collinson, born in 1873. Well, Fred Actually enlisted in the Lancashire Fusiliers between 1889 and 1895. Now, what's interesting about that is we know that he was born in 1873, yet he claimed he was 18 when he joined the army. Clearly, that maths doesn't quite work out. He was 17, young 17-year-old at most. However, Lancashire Fusiliers it is. And whilst in the Lancashire Fusiliers, he continues to play football. He plays for Everton in the 1892 season. He then transfers to Bury in what is arguably their most successful sort of period of their history. Well, not arguably, actually, it's just fact. Between 1892 and 1899, he's part of the rise of Bury Football Club, including the team that wins the second division in 1894. He leaves for Blackburn Rovers in 1899. Had he stayed on, he would have gone on to probably play in the two FA Cup victories, the two wins. Who would think Bury twice FA Cup winners? One of them 6-0 trouncing a Derby County, I believe it was. So he just misses out on those FA Cup appearances, but he's at Blackburn Rovers. Whilst he's at Blackburn Rovers, he enlists in the Lancashire Fusiliers and goes off to fight in the Boer War. He's with them for 3 years, and including seeing action on both the Spion Kop and at Ladysmith. Quite incredible places if you ever get a chance to visit. When he comes back from South Africa, not sure whether he plays any football anymore, but we know that on most of the census returns, he puts himself down as a gas meter inspector. And it's while serving in there that he also enlists in 1914 as a gas meter inspector into the 5th Battalion, the Lancashire Fusiliers, who are initially part of that 42nd Division troops that go out to the Suez Canal zone. That's where he would have seen action for the first time. And then lands in sort of the May of 1915, early May 1915, they land at Helles. And it doesn't last too long, unfortunately, on the peninsula. What we've got here is an account by Second Lieutenant Horridge that mentions him by name. It says, eventually we got to the trench behind the front line. Next to me was an old soldier called Collinson. We got out of the trench and had to go at the double because the fire was very heavy. The bullets were hissing around, swish, swish, swish. We ran halfway and then we got behind a mound and I said to Collinson, look, we've got to go on. And off we set again. I wasn't too bad a runner and I outstripped Collinson and eventually leapt into the frontline trench. I'm sorry to say that Collinson in the last 10 yards got hit through the chest or stomach. We got him in, but he died later. And today, here he is on the Helles Memorial. That was on the 15th of May. He was literally in Gallipoli for days before he was killed. And of course, one of those many footballers who knows what they would have gone on to achieve had they not been lost in the war. One that does make it through is this incredible character, Ara Potes. He enlists in the 7th Manchesters, of course, of the same 42nd East Lancs Division. He'd actually played for Manchester United in the season before the war, 13-14 season, but they were a pretty decent side. 1915, he enlists in 7th Manchesters, survives the war pretty much through the whole thing unscathed. So that would enlist, if you think about 7th Manchesters, 42nd East Lancs Division, that would include not only his time on the Gallipoli Campaign, but also landing on the Western Front and fighting through as far as the sort of breaking of the Hindenburg line and up to the Selle River crossing. So quite a fascinating period war he would have seen, and then goes back to play professional football again, 1919 to 1920, plays for Manchester United. He gets signed for the princely sum of £100 for Wolves, and in 1921 plays for Wolves in the FA Cup final. Here it is. I think it's at Stamford Bridge, that stadium. They lose 1-0 to the Spurs, and that's a picture of the winning goal going in. But nevertheless, Gallipoli veteran, Western Front veteran, Manchester United player, now playing in the cup final after the war. 1922, shortly after he retires from first-class football and plays for the lovely named Bloxwich Strollers, I hope they still exist, and Dudley Town. And like all good footballers, ends up running a pub. Most good footballers end up as pub landlords. And in this case, this is the Blue Ball Pub in Wolverhampton. course, where I did my master's degree. Is it Mitchell and Butler? I think is sort of something, the M&B, but local brewery there, before dying in Walsall, aged 90. So a good life, really, by Arthur Potts, and a little bit more of him later. Completely different sort of character is this fella, Charles Edward Taylor. Look at that spelling and surname. He really is quite a mysterious character. Let's see what we know about him. We know that he's born in 1879 in Devon, a place called Ivybridge. Um, his father at that time said that he was a gentleman living off of his own means. So he's born into some not inconsiderable wealth. In fact, we know he goes to prep school and Cheltenham College. In 1900, he's commissioned into the Connaught Rangers. And what we can see from his army career, he finds it quite hard to hold a job down for too long, because our only sort of knowledge of him we have militarily prior to the First World War is this lone South Africa medal in his name that's in the Manchester Regiment Museum. Well, in fact, when we look at South Africa, he had served there with the first Manchesters, so he transferred from the Connaught Rangers. And after the war, he goes on to serve in Singapore, Secunderabad, and Comte. So he gets around the globe, as you would do if you were serving in the regular army at that time in history. By 1911, he's moved again to take up position with the colonial office in the Southern Nigerian Regiment. And in 1912, he kind of resigns his commission and drops off the order of battle somewhat until the First World War. Well, actually, bit of digging, and we found out that in February 1912, someone in the battalion claimed that Taylor owed him quite a lot of money, and that he petitioned that Charles Taylor should be declared bankrupt. Now, this is a no-no for a serving officer. He reasoned that the officer's living costs are greater than his salary. That was Taylor's defense, that it cost me more to be an officer than I actually get paid. But even this regarding, the army said, well, you are expected to be able to pay your own expenses. Petitioning creditors were unable to ascertain the present residence, so no one knew where Taylor is. He literally drops off the planet, and as far as we can see, doesn't repay any of these bills. So in his absence, the judge declares him to be bankrupt on the 22nd of August. And a public examination of Charles' finances were held on the 1st of October at the Bankruptcy Buildings in Carey Street, London. Charles was eventually released from his bankruptcy on the 11th of September 1913, but there was nothing to suggest that his actual location was ever discovered where he was on the planet. Well, could have dug a bit harder. I'm lucky they unfortunately they didn't have Google in those days, because what we do know is in Kalgoorlie in Western Australia in July 1914, he gets married to a girl called Lily Stone. So he's decided to withdraw, obviously resign his commission in the army and head off down to Western Australia. He obviously, when war's declared, decides that he does need to enlist in the army again, because in April 1915, he arrives on a boat from Australia. And then in June 1915, we see him commissioned into the 10th North Staffords. Now, whilst they are drafting officers elsewhere, by July 1918, he finds himself attached to the 1st 8th Lancashire Fusiliers. And on the 7th of August, in the Battle of the Crafia Vineyard, he is killed, no known grave, on the Helles Memorial. Now, what's that got to do with football, you say? Well, this rather interesting eBay purchase quite a considerable number of years ago I got that says tassel off of the football club cap of Charles Taylor, believed killed at the Dardanelles. Well, he was killed at the Dardanelles. And so this is a tassel off of some form of football cap. I can't trace him to the battalion football side at all. But what I find interesting is that's the same colours as Cheltenham College, which is where we know he went to school. So I suspect he played for his college, won that cap, and then would go on. But an incredible character, given his moving around the globe and then his disappearance. But someone who I remember whenever I'm passing the Helles Memorial. Another mystery, really, that will soon hopefully be correctly remembered is this chap, Lloyd Roose. Now, Lee Roose was born in Wrexham in 1877, was a medical student, 1900, lots of doctors, played football. It was a good outdoor pursuit as such. By the time we get to 1901 and up until the period of 1912, it's fair to say that Lee Roose was the most significant goalkeeper in Britain. He played for Stoke City, Everton, Sunderland, Celtic, Port Vale, Huddersfield, Aston Villa, and even the Woolwich Arsenal, who were about to leave South London, by the way, and move to the posh area of Islington. Not that I'm a bitter Charlton fan from South London. Lee Roose, during that time, were playing two FA Cup semi-finals, one Scottish Cup semi-final. He was in goal for a game that I'm sure they still talk about on Wearside, where Sunderland beat Newcastle 9-1 and actually capped 24 times for Wales. Perhaps his most incredible legacy is the Roose Law that was introduced in 1912. One of his tactics was to bounce the ball almost up to the halfway line. No one could get it off him. And then, of course, boot it forward so that his forwards could score. It was this tactic that they really couldn't cope with that brought in the law that goalkeepers could not handle the ball outside of the penalty box. And you think, that impacts on our game today. And yet Lee Roose was the reason that rule was brought in, so they couldn't bounce it all the way up the front line. Here he is in sort of an early sort of sweet card or cigarette card or whatever, a cartoon of Lee Roose. Now, in 1912, he says that he retired in a stand against professionalism. Probably retired because he didn't like them bringing in the law to stop him dribbling the ball out of the goal. But what we do know is, like, just prior that period, 1912 to the start of the First World War, he was one of the UK's most recognisable socialites. Lots of female admirers. Would all be dressed in Savile Row suits, dated Mary Lloyd, had very extravagant tastes with champagnes and some of the restaurants around the West End. But still, his Welsh Methodist, I believe, but very pacifist family probably frowned on his sort of lavish lifestyle. But he certainly followed that family, and that's what brings him to the Dardanelles. In 1914, he enlists for the YMCA, gets himself attached to an RAMC unit serving on the peninsula, and in late 1915 actually goes missing. Now, why is this important? Well, this is until 1920. His family believed he'd been killed in the Gallipoli Campaign because they heard no more from him. It was only his sister who went to an event organised by the Daily Mail at Twickenham Rugby Stadium, who was sat alongside a guy called Tom Webster, who worked for the Daily Mail, and talked about her brother being lost in Gallipoli, when Tom Webster said, no, he didn't go missing at Gallipoli. I played cricket with him in Egypt after the evacuation. And that was the first time the family had any idea that he had left Gallipoli intact. So where was he? Well, it's been up until quite recently. This has been a mystery. What we do know now is that in 1916, he re-enlisted into the 9th Royal Fusiliers under a different spelling of his name. If you look, that's spelt slightly differently, Rouse now. And in August 1916, was actually awarded a military medal with that battalion. Perhaps the name change was linked back to this pacifist family, and him wanting to join an infantry unit might not have gone down so well with his own family, so he enlisted. But we do know that military medal, we've got a sort of an account of it, if not a citation, which says Private Lee Rouse, who had never visited the trenches before, was in the sap when the Flammenwerfer attack began. He managed to get back along the trench and nearly choked with fumes, with his clothes burned, refused to go to the dressing station. He continued to throw bombs until his arm gave out, and then joining the covering party, used his rifle with great effect. Now, we never actually got the opportunity to discuss it any further with Lee, because in 7th of October, in one of the most appalling parts of the Somme battlefield, really Goudecourt, almost dropped off the itinerary of a lot of tour companies, but some really horrific fighting in horrific conditions there in October 1916. He's one of 200 men of the 9th Royal Fusiliers who goes missing. And again, he's on the Tietval Memorial. And up until this moment, the Army records and the CWGC are yet to change his name. So maybe that'll happen at some stage in the future to reflect who he actually is. And so, it's very likely that his family never actually realised what happened to him. I don't know. This is fascinating. Helen Bentwich, If I Forget Thee, was a memoir that she published. Fascinating character, actually. And I'm very indebted to my friend Jim, who is the chairman of the Essex WFA branch, that sent me a copy of this book and said, "Oh, Clive, you want to read this?" She was quite a force of nature, very well-to-do family who taught her to ride motorcycles, that sort of thing. She initially worked at the Woolwich Arsenal. They threw her out when she decided to start a trade union, which was not what was wanted at the time. She headed off to stay with a good friend of the family, George Bernard Shaw. And they had lots of discussion at politics and things like that. And then she decided she was going to start up the Land Army. So very heavily involved in females, women working on the Land Army. But for her, she wanted more action, so she enlists and goes over as a nursing aide and serves in the Dardanelles theatres on a ship at sea. And the reason I mention her today are these two wonderful quotes that appear in her book. The first thing is that she actually, at great expense to herself, gets newspapers sent across to the troops so they can read the news. But she says there, the extraordinary thing about the men is that they take no interest at all in the war. They'll dash at the papers as soon as they arrive in the morning. And if I ask what the news is, they'll answer, "News? We're sick of the war. We only look at the football. Football is the common bond among them," which I think is an amazing thing. Even more interesting is this comment here. It says, she says, "There was great indignation one day when they read some man who is one of the best forwards somewhere in the north had enlisted. What did he want to go and spoil the team for?" was the general comment. One might think that having enlisted themselves, they'd be furious with those who are still playing games. It's obvious that the papers don't represent the opinions of these men when they write of slackers still playing football. Now, I can actually relate to that. When I was in the army, the last thing I wanted was Charlton centre forward to enlist in the army because I wanted him banging the goals in at home while I do my bit overseas. So it's an interesting take because you don't often see it. A lot of people assume, yeah, get them out here. We're in the trenches, they're playing football. Do that, there's no football. And that's the last thing that the men wanted. Which moves us on to rather timely onto probably the core of this talk, which is in July 1915, when there is a particular morale crisis that occurs amongst not only across the whole of the expeditionary force in Gallipoli, but certainly at 8 Corps. Look at that report from the Deputy Director of Medical Services, who writes, "There is throughout the troops a general feeling of lassitude and depression which lowers the power of resistance to disease. However, expect the measures intended to boost morale that the new Corps commander was introducing to make a positive difference. Morale can impact on men's powers of resistance to disease." That's how significant an issue it is. The man that's coming in is Joey Davis. You can see him on the right there, Lieutenant General Sir Francis Davis, to give him his full title. He arrives in the Gallipoli Theatre in August 1915, looks across and sees, right, what can we do? What are the very quick changes that we can make to impact on morale? And they're twofold, actually. And Gary Sheffield wrote this in the BCH Journal a few years ago. The first one was to improve leisure facilities. For instance, by providing refreshments, raising bands from personnel of each division, and by staging sports matches. Two snapshots of his efforts are of Hood and Anson teams playing football, and the Royal Naval Division final of the Dardanelles Cup. More of that later. And the 52nd Divisional Band's rendition of the Mikado that was interrupted by shelling. So maybe not the best setting for music and football, but nevertheless, let's go ahead. Now, whilst there are numerous references of the Dardanelles Cup that are mentioned in various books and what have you, they don't really have been placed together until, well, not only what we're about to see here, but a brilliant article by Bernie de Brugio a few years ago that appeared in the Gallipolian. So what was the Dardanelles Cup and how did it look? It was actually quite fascinating. This come on a little bit from when I gave the presentation early in this year. It was a 32-team multi-unit tournament, and it was played mainly out on, or entirely out on the Hellas front for 8 Corps units. And these were divided, well, the ties were played between October 1915 and January 1916. There were 3 divisional knockout games. which would then lead you up to, or rounds that would then lead you up to a final. And the four groups were separated, as you can see there on the table. Pool A, bottom right-hand corner, 42nd Division. Pool B, 52nd Lowlanders. Pool C, men of the Royal Naval Division. And then Pool D, Tovers. So I've just given them the core flash there. So any other unit that wanted to put a team in would be straight away put in to Pool D. There were two semi-finals then played between the four divisional winners before the final that was actually played on Imbros, maybe Lemnos. We see different accounts after the evacuation. But what we do know, Anson Battalion beat the 5th Highland Infantry 2-1 in the final. And that was the only game that was played off of the peninsula. We've got a few accounts of it. 52nd Division history actually says towards Morto Bay, there were several fields surrounded by trees and bushes, which prevented them from being easily observed from Achibaba. Here were all the requisites for football, and accordingly, Sir Francis David offered a trophy to be called the Dardanelles Cup to be won in a knockout tournament. We see from 8 Corps Artillery War Diary, says first round of the competition for the Dardanelles Cup was presented by General H. Davis, commanding the 8th Corps. 147th Field Artillery Brigade versus 15th Heavy Brigade. The result was 1-2 after a heavily fought game. Actually, we also see Anson Battalion, who went on to win the whole thing. Second Lieutenant James Curzon Hilton in December writes, at 0945, the CO gave a lecture to all officers on the general slackness of men with respect to saluting. I inspected rifles at 10:15. During the morning, we got some rather bog shells over from the Turks, several of which were dropped in the straight lines just to the rear of us. The Hood Battalion played Anson Battalion at football this morning in the divisional final of the Dardanelles Cup. The result was a 5-5 draw, and what was described as a vacation spirit was making itself manifest across the division. Now, it obviously went to penalties or extra time because we know Anson won out, and eventually they would win the entire tournament. The trophy is still missing for this. I've booked an appointment to go down to the Royal Naval silverware store in Portsmouth, where I want to trawl through because I reckon somewhere on there might be the Dardanelles Cup. One unit that gives us a good account of their experiences in it is the 7th Manchesters. And their war diary almost continually mentions their exploits in this. And they get to the final of the 42nd Division. First, we see on the 17th of November there, it says, and played the first 6 Manchesters. The 6th Battalion got quickly into their stride and early in the first half established a useful lead of 2-0. This, however, was levelled to 2-2 by half-time, and the sides changed ground, or the tie changed ground, with the 7th showing the best form, finally winning 4-2 with goals from Hancock, remember that name, twice scored, Pearson, Wilton, and Bertie Nidd. Watching the game said, if we were not stopped by shells, as they only came fairly near to us during the game. It's a lovely quote, isn't it? The following day, with little time for rest, they took on the Ardwick Battalion, the first 8th Manchesters, winning 3-1. Again, Hancock scoring. After this match, the battalion moved forward into the firing line, and no football could have been indulged in during our stay there. The stay was a very trying one for us, but the team were fortunate to escape casualties, though a good many of these were mixed up with a mine explosion, which was quite a nerve-wracking experience. So, not many casualties in the battalion football team, but they were blown up by a mine. Eventually, as soon as they came out of their time in the trenches, they went back to Wye Ravine, and here at the Wye Ravine pitch that we'll see in a moment, on the 10th of December, they turned out to, unexpectedly with little notice, to play the RMC and won 1-0. And then eventually they got to play the 10th Manchesters on the 11th of December, just one day later, that said, we got to the divisional final. Before we could proceed with the game, we had to wait till the Turks had finished shelling the ground. Shells actually dropped right into the centre of the playing pitch and even through the goals. We had plenty of misfortunate hereabouts hitting the goalpost, but we just couldn't score. So I've forgotten about the shelling already. although much better than our opponents. They scored rather a tame goal from a bouncing ball over the head of our goalkeeper Moore, who could have done with a few more inches in height. The goal proved sufficient to put us out of the match and out of the competition. The long spell in the trenches previously for these matches was probably a contributing cause to this defeat. The match was fated to be the last in which our brilliant centre forward Hancock was to appear. He was one of the last men of the battalion to be killed just before our departure from the peninsula. Well, a couple of things there. Firstly, you can see our chap Ara Potes from earlier in the talk, who was played in a number of those games. And there we can see the original grave marker of Mr. Hancock, the goal scorer, who today is buried in Twelvetree Copse Cemetery. So I quite often go and visit him and think, what a player you were. Killed on Christmas Day, 1915. Just doesn't seem right, does it? 20 days before the eventual release. Now, at the same time, the 29th Division were playing out a thing called the Stockdale Cup, which is different to the Dardanelles Cup. This was introduced by Brigadier Herbert Stockdale, who was the Chief of Royal Artillery 29th Division. He coordinated this, no doubt, as some sort of morale booster. It was a mini tournament that was played out. Regular scores in the war diary. I won't read them all, but I've got them all down here. Stockdale himself was a football fan. He was awarded DSO before the end of the First World War, but we know that he played at Wellington College for football. He played football at the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich and was in their first 11 again. Served in the South African War before going to Gallipoli. And individual trophies, you can see it ringed there, were actually given to the winners of this tournament. So we know at least 11, maybe 12, if you include a coach, who were given out. 4 of them are still in existence. We know that the family of George Gifford have got one, because I found a reference to that online. And also this Frank Kirby. You can see there's George Gifford's medal index card as sergeant. Frank Kirby, which I believe is the chap in this photograph here, wound stripe. Mourning button, because one of his next of kin would have died. There he is, holding his trophy. Sadly, he too would be killed in action before the war's out. There you can see his entry, 8th of August 1917, buried, I think it's in Balliol, where he's buried. Steve Chambers has got one. He's got one of everything, hasn't he, really? He used to have 2, and here I've brought out to Berlin, might not be able to see it in the dark, but I've got one as well of these Stockdale trophies. It's beautifully engraved to 60th Heavy Battery RGA, who win the Stockdale Cup, played at Helles. So with that in mind, let's look at where they played the football. This is the most famous image of football. And some of you will notice the deliberate mistake, and we'll come to that a bit later as we move through the talk. But the caption on this photograph says, British soldiers playing late one evening on Gallipoli as the Turks were shelling the areas seen in the background. The highest point on the horizon is Achi Baba. This is Australian War Museum quote, and there's Achi Baba away in the distance. And using a number of these features, we start to work out exactly where it is. So where was football played on the peninsula? Well, if we look, we've got a few clues here, and with the help of 2 incredible guys. Firstly, Bernie from Australia that I've mentioned before, and also John Winterburn. John is the landscape archaeologist for the Hejaz Railway. It's obviously quite difficult theatre for him to operate in the moment, given global events. So he kindly offered to run his software program over the area where I thought the football pitch might be to see if we could locate it. And roughly came up with an area like this. And if you're watching Bernie, I've just read through John's report, and I did put it on the wrong place previously, and the last time I gave you this presentation back in February. So that's where John sort of worked it out. Now, if you look at the map there at the bottom of the screen, this is a 52nd Division map, shows Hunter Western Hill, as we see there. And look at this road that comes around, and we can see it again here. And look at that strange feature on their map. Very much like a football field. Well, and now if we look at this photo, which shows football being played in the Dardanelles, we look at this row of trees here. Very much like this little bit of scrub that runs around. Could be that bit, but certainly around there. And best of all, this map that's now been sent on to me that shows a lot of the infrastructure around that area. And we can actually see there mentioned the word football ground. So when we're over there next Gallipoli Association tour next May, and lots of people are kicking around looking for nose cones and things, I shall be looking for studs of football boots on that location. I just think it'll be incredible to actually sit and think this is where they played football. Now, this was known as the aviation ground, but it wasn't the only place we played. So we can see from Gagan's Bluff, there was another pitch played, and here it is marked in this little open ground here. There's 12 Tree Copse Cemetery. This is about 2/3 of the way up Gully Ravine, maybe a bit further, and it's in shallow ground. In fact, it looks like this now. You can see little flat open area. Couple of accounts we've got from it. One comes from the Queen's Own Royal West Kent Journal, January 1917, that says, our great and only appearance took place against the Sussex on the famous ground at Gagan's Bluff on Sunday in November 1915. This place was one of the spots where we were supposed to rest. A horseshoe of small hills hid us from the trenches and provided holes for dugouts. There we could sit and watch the traffic up and down the gully, the graveyard below with its occasional ceremony, and glorious sunsets. And from here too, we could watch the great football match. And then there's a lovely quote from Edward Harris of the 1st Border Regiment, who went back on a 1975 Gallipoli Association pilgrimage to the peninsula. God, don't you wish you could have been there with those guys and listened to their tales? Well, they wander up Gully Ravine there, and he says, about halfway we came to a wide part of the gully where George told us was the only place on the peninsula the lads could have a game of football. That's not quite correct, but, you know, it was the area he remembers. Whilst the rest of the party did a recce for some particular point of interest, I sat in the shade of a tree. I drank a Coca-Cola kindly given to me by Duckworth, and I imagined the game in progress. What a lovely memory that is. Now, we do have an excellent account here by Sergeant Sid Abel White of the 2nd Londons. His letters are held by the Imperial War Museum, and when I look to them, I'm pretty convinced no one's actually ever taken them out of the box. I've seen no reference to him at all. He was a very, very keen football fan. This is one of the medals that was awarded to him for playing football with the 2nd Londons. And it starts really in Malta in January 1915 when he's writing home, and he says, the meat we get at dinner would be better employed as paving the roads, but still it has its advantages, for one mouthful lasts all day. It takes nearly all day to chew it, so you ain't got time for a second mouthful. We get pudding once a week. I think it takes the cook a week to make it, and he makes it well, damn well. There's no fear of it ever falling to pieces with tenderness, and kind words have no effect on the pudding at all. We generally use it for football until it breaks the plaster off the wall, and then we roll it outside. This Thursday afternoon, there's cricket, football, and other tennis going on outside, so I'm going out for a game of football with some of my friends. And he goes on repeatedly referencing football. Now, one of the fascinating things that he mentions is that he writes to his dad on January the 26th, 1916, saying, of course you would have heard of the final evacuation of the peninsula. We've not seen any papers for weeks and weeks, and we know nothing about any other part of the war. But I suppose you know this bit. One thing you might be proud to know is, and we often hear people claim this, but I believe him. He says, I was the last but one man to leave the peninsula. The other one was the demobilization officer who fired all of the fuses to blow up the mines. He left the shore with me. I took him the orders to fire up. I felt it a distinction and proud of it myself, but I shall never forget that last week or the last few hours. When I left the shore, there was not a single Britisher or Frenchman of any sort left on the Gallipoli Peninsula. It seemed so weird to be practically the last man to have the land to have the land that all the world had been watching for months and months. The reason I was the last man was that I was told to get 20 men from my company. I took the football team with me, and they reported to the military landing officer of the famous River Clyde. When I got there, I was told my men were required as guides to lead troops down to the beach as they left. It was night work only, and for several thousands we got off the beach each night, as well as thousands of Frenchmen. In total, it took us 8 nights to clear everyone off the peninsula. I was in charge of all the guides. I naturally had to see every man, including all the guides, off the shore. The demolition officer then fired the fuses, left the beach with me. I called the roll call of my men, the footballers, and we stepped on board. Now, Sid, unfortunately, isn't going to last very long. And how often am I saying this on tonight's talk? He was killed attached to the Queen's Westminster Rifles just prior to the Somme, and is buried in Fonky Villas Cemetery. But he left that claim. Now, one of the people that served in his battalion is this chap here. I'm sure some of you may recognise him from that shot just on the right as a footballer as well. His name was Billy Cotton. And Billy Cotton says, all of our lads in the village, the village is referring to wonderfully is Westminster. And I've always said London's a collection of villages. Here we say Billy's agreeing with me. He said, we were great soccer fans of Westminster School. Public schools had wonderful players. Many of them went on to become internationals. When they were playing a big match against Charterhouse, literally thousands of us would stand around Vincent Square. The school had a better following in those days than Spurs. Everybody was there for nothing at all. And how we used to shout for everyone. Westminster, we used to sing over and over for 90 minutes. When he got to Malta, he says, we do a 5-hour route march in full kit in the morning, and then we play inter-garrison football in the afternoon on a rock-hard pitch that was as wearing as a route march and worse on your knees if you fell. He then talks about his time at the W Beach, and the football team was used as an ammunition carrying party. He said, I was on the beach loading up one day when I saw Kitchener come ashore. He walked over W Beach and inland for half a mile. He was gesticulating, but I couldn't hear what he was saying. Shortly after, we supported a unit on our right attacking a Turkish trench by rifle and machine gun fire. Before the attack, 3 mines were exploded, and the lads rushed forward, took the trenches, and barricaded themselves in on the far side. Turks brought down fire that caused a number of casualties, including my company commander, Captain Duckfield, who was wounded. I did my bit to restore morale, and I said to my CSM, I'll bet you any money, like we ain't going to be here in a few months' time. And I told him about seeing Kitchener. Well, it was actually 2 months to go before the 2 and Tupneys moved out because we were the very last men off the peninsula. So he, backs up what Abel White said. Billy Cotton was a good footballer himself, played for Wimbledon in the Southern League, which is a very, very high standard after the war. But one of his other passions here was motor racing. He used to drive at Brooklands and various places like that. Of course, we know him as the light entertainment of the BBC, Wakey Wakey, and he was a big Charlton fan. And it was Billy Cotton that recorded when the Red Robin goes bob, bob, bobbing along, which we know was first played in the early 1950s. In tribute of Charlton Athletic, and it's exactly what they play today as the teams run out. Let's turn our turns. We're nearly there now. If you're hanging on for this talk, we'll turn our attention to our Australian friends. And this is probably the most famous photograph that we see with regards to Australians playing sport on the peninsula. It's the famous cricket match that was taking place on Shell Green there. However, this photo, if I return to it, British soldiers playing football. Well, these aren't British soldiers. They're pretty much Australians. And when they're out the line, what they were doing, maybe this dates it to May, time of the Griffith Vineyard. I don't know, but here they are kicking a football around. And it's actually not as unusual as you think it is. Australians are playing soccer in the First World War. I mean, just a quick trawl of the AWM will show football teams here. This is football medals being awarded on the steps of Moorlancourt Church. And here again, another Australian football team. In fact, we've got a number of examples. A cable from Cairo to headquarters Anzac that was sent during the peninsula. It says, send Amelie 6 tents, 10 small pianos, 5 million printed leopard papers and envelopes, 50 sets of cricket material, and 50 soccer footballs. So they wanted it. There are numerous examples, say, of football being played by Australians across Gallipoli and the Western Front. But what happens in the 1930s, there's almost a cultural deletion of soccer being played in favour of what became Australian rules. But at a time in the First World War, it was only really the Victorian states that played, or teams in Victoria that played what was Victoria rules. It spread across Australia a bit later that. And in fact, the Hobart Mercury refers to soccer players as being in the minority, very self-centered and very selfish. Soccer is just merely a winter game. It doesn't have any following, status, or genuine sportsmanlike feel to the average Australian. Their game has been one that was developed 50 odd years earlier and is now under the name of Australian football. It's sort of saying that all of the skills of the Anzac could be encapsulated in playing of Australian rules football, which is unfortunate because we know soccer played a major part. In fact, the only moving images we've got of Australians playing sport in Gallipoli Campaign is a very short film that shows them playing soccer against a Royal Naval side here, which we believe took place on Lemnos. Here we can see the HMS Hunter. This is from the same game. The crew of HMS Hunter playing against the 6th Battalion of the AIF. You can see the difference in the equipment they've got. They're still keen, but look at the Navy guys in proper football gear. And there, here we are, our Anzacs of 6AF turning out in their everyday workwear. This was at a camp, here it says, on Lemnos. William Lycett, in his diary for the 4th Field Ambulance, continually refers to football. It says, one of his letters on Friday, 2nd of April says, Reveille was not until 6:30 in the morning. We paraded at 7, where we were informed it was Good Friday and we're to have a holiday, and the day was to be Sunday. On 10:15, our corps played a soccer match against the 16th AIF. I was playing centre half for our corps, and after a hard game and an element of luck, our side we won by 3 goals to 2. I also had the good fortune to score the second goal for our side. We played on the Heliopolis Sporting Club's ground, so I returned to camp straight away and had a good shower before dinner. I lay in the tent reading till after tea when 3 of us and my cousin, who came to see me, took a walk into Heliopolis. He goes on the 28th of September 1915, says Reveille at 6:30, Braid at 7. Last night, Monash announced a British victory along 50 miles of the Western Front. Our troops were very active. The Russians seemed to have stemmed the German tide. At 11 a.m. this morning, I went with a party of rations. This afternoon, Captain Jeffries gave us soccer football, which had been sent to him from Egypt. So we had a good rough and tumble right through till tea time. 1st of October, we played football all day. 2nd of October, we kicked our football around, and it goes on and on and on. And we've got another little picture of Australians playing football. Here it is. This is blue jackets or naval personnel on their way to watch a game of football against the Australians. This was Raw Scots. Let's have a look. 23rd of December, Australians played against team of the Raw Scots Territorials and got beat by 6 goals to 0. I wonder if you look at the kit they were playing at. So what is the culture of soccer in regards to the First World War? Well, this is the first international picture we have on record of an Australian soccer team. And this dates to 1923 when they played the Soccer Ashes against New Zealand. This was a silver razor box that was carried throughout the campaign by a New Zealander, decided to get this mounted onto a wooden box, and inside it they had sand from both Victoria and from New Zealand, and they decided this was going to be an annually played game between Australia and New Zealand, and it was going to be known as the Soccer Ashes. And it kind of disappeared until it recently appeared, found again in Australia. And here we can actually see that wooden board with the Soccer Ashes. It says, the article says, the Ashes, incidentally, are a genuine trophy. They're a relic of the New Zealand team's visit to Australia 13 years ago, when the ashes of cigars smoked by the captains of New Zealand Australian teams were placed in a plated silver razor case, which in turn was enclosed in a cask of New Zealand Australian timbers, honeysuckle, maple, sand, and suitably surrounded and inscribed. The trophy bears a record of test games between the two countries since 1922 and was won 3 years ago by Australia, which beat the visiting New Zealand team in every test. Wouldn't it be great if we introduced the Soccer Ashes again to be played by Australia and New Zealand going forward, because it's got that link that dates right back to the Gallipoli Campaign. So what was happening at the other end of the wire, and we really are on the downward slope to the end of this talk now, but it's right that we mention them. Three major sides in Turkish football, even to this day, are all Istanbul sides: Beşiktaş, Galatasaray, and Fenerbahce. And if we look at Ali Samayen in 1905, when Galatasaray were formed, he says, "Our aim is to play together like Englishmen, to have a colour and a name to beat non-Turkish teams." At that stage in Istanbul, there were lots of Westerners still in the area, Constantinople, playing football. They wanted to be the first native Turkish side to take them on. If we look at their war records, 3 Beşiktaş players died in the Gallipoli campaign. Galatasaray had 9 casualties throughout the war, most of them at Gallipoli, and Fenerbahce 3 more. First, another example of football playing a role with the Ottomans is this wonderful description of an action on the 23rd of April 1916. So in the Palestine campaign, that says the Turks executed daring raid on the British outposts at Katia, deploying 2 infantry battalions, a mountain howitzer battery, and a volunteer camel cavalry regiment. The operation proved highly successful, resulting in the capture of the British cavalry unit stationed at Katia. The commanding officer, along with 23 officers and 257 troopers, fell into Turkish hands. According to Turkish sources, the British soldiers were engrossed in a football match when the Turks ambushed them. So sometimes you don't want to be involved in football and you're about to be overrun. Perhaps the most fascinating story I picked up with Turkey is this: the Robinson family. It's the spelling there, Robinson. And here you can see their names in full. They were actually an Anglo-Indian family who converted to Islam and found it quite a struggle socially. So as a result, settled down in Istanbul, then Constantinople. The 3 sons attended Galatasaray High School and played for the football team pre-war that would go on to be the football club now. I think as I give this presentation, are actually playing in a Champions League qualifying game. 2 of them who are of military age served at the Gallipoli campaign. Here we can see the 2 brothers that were killed. Abdurrahman, who was killed on the Caucasian front, and we can also see Yaqub, who was killed in Baghdad. The surviving brother Ahmed became the club president of Galatasaray and really was a key player in them becoming a first-class team that we now know playing in European tournaments. But it was this quote that really got me about how fascinated the Turks were and their passion for their football club. And this was a letter written home to Ahmed from his older brother who was going to be killed later in the war. It says, "My brother, we've arrived in Erzurum in 35 days after our departure from Istanbul. We will be here for a few days. Then we will go to the front line. I have the badge of our club on my uniform, Galatasaray. I shall bear that badge in all battles. If I die, the badge will be on my chest, and I will be buried with that badge. Long live Galatasaray." I mean, the passion of football to write something like that is, and there's your motivation. Even after the Gallipoli campaign ends, and here we see Tim Harrington on the right, part of the Treaty of Lausanne. One of the things Tim Harrington writes about in his memoirs, and I've given a talk on Tim's life before, and his role in post-war Turkey, where he narrowly avoids war between Britain and Turkey, quite an amazing part of diplomacy. Another talk for another day. But he says, "My wife and I were left with the guards when we arrived at the quayside. There were the guards of honor of British, French, Italian, and Turkish colors. When I saluted the Turkish flag, the whole mob broke and was surrounded by a crowd of 15,000 Turks, all friendly and delightful. It was a scene one can never forget." Now, Tim's relationship with Turks had not always been that way. He was particularly not liked by the men of Fenerbahce because he found out they were gun running for Turkish independence and put a load of them in prison. But one of his parting shots was he wanted to arrange a thing called the Harrington Cup. This was going to be a combined guards team. The guards brigade at this stage were serving in the Constantinople area in Çanakkale. And he challenged Fenerbahce, the people who, in fact, no, Fenerbahce said, "We'll accept accept your challenge. What he said was in the newspaper, my team will play any local team who wants to play for the Harrington Cup. Fenerbahce, recently those of gun running, said, we'll have a go at this. Despite the fact that Harrington brought across 4 professional players from the UK as ringers, we lost the game. They lost the game 2-1. Fenerbahce victorious. The Harrington Cup, which was meant to be a sort of moment of British dominance as we left Trinakilly and the Dardanelles Straits for the last time, actually was soon forgotten, not reported because we lost. And the trophy itself today is kept in the Fenerbahce Museum. So I think it shows that football from the very start of the campaign to the very end played its role. Fascinating twists and turns, a lot more to learn as we go forward. This is just the start of what we study into the campaign. But it's all over the recruiting posters, you can see. And I'll just end with a very fine quote by Jonathan Wilson, a football historian, that says, on the one hand, football is entirely trivial, but football is the most universal culture mode there has ever been. It is everywhere in the world, and it takes a huge amount of the emotional, intellectual space and a huge amount of the people's time. And with that, I shall end.